Piers, thank you very much indeed for coming along to this podcast. And I know that you've already done quite a few podcasts, so I'm mildly curious why you would choose my humble little platform to come along to. But also, your insights, because you have a really interesting career. I immediately looked up LinkedIn and your website, and you've had an interesting journey. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it's great to talk to you, Tim. So, my journey. So, I've been in broadly the areas of professional, personal development, change, innovation, training for coaching for 20 plus years now. I started when I was relatively young into coaching.
Mhm.
I found it absolutely fascinating. I'd read law at university. I'd then had a spell in FMCG sales and marketing, working with some big corporates, and then into sort of consulting around innovation. And I found that the people variable was huge.
Mhm.
And whereas before I'd looked into things like counseling, I hadn't found those very helpful. And then when coaching came out, which was more future focused, and I coupled it with NLP, neuro linguistic programming, I found that very powerful for myself. And I thought, I think a lot of people could benefit from this. So I was a young man, and I quit my sort of paid job and set myself up as a coach in 2000. So that's 24 years as we sit. I haven't said 24 years today. It's been January the 2nd. 24 years ago, I started coaching.
Mhm.
Um, Firstly, just with private individuals, because I wanted to break from the corporate world. And then about 5 years later, well, maybe 4 years later, I took the coaching into the corporate world. In a sort of change, particularly in a change management context.
Mhm.
And I also found what was becoming popular then was people wanting to learn coaching skills.
Mhm.
So that's managers, leaders, other consultants wanted to learn coaching skills. So I did a lot of coaching skills training, mentored a lot of other coaches, coupled with the NLP as well, and a whole bunch of other tools and techniques that I picked up: appreciative inquiry, systems thinking, serious play, clean language, symbolic modeling, lots and lots of stuff. And then that all kind of changed in about 2008, 2009, when I came across something that sort of turned everything on its head. When I realized how the human experience worked, really. I realized that it's not little me creating the world kind of outside. There's no kind of outside world in me. It's all sort of one, and it all comes from the mind. So the paradigm of materialism kind of fell over for me, and I was like, oh wow, that changes everything. That changes how I see the world. That changes how I do my change work, my coaching. And then really I spent 10 years kind of trying to find a way to talk about that, which is quite profound,
Mhm.
quite spiritual in a way,
Mhm.
to businesses that didn't scare the horses. Because as soon as you mention anything too profound, businesses are like, well, how's this help my bottom line? So I developed a wrapper, a codification called Quality of Mind,
Mhm.
which has been evolving for the last 10, 12, 15, gosh, even more years now, and has got more and more direct, more and more elegant, more and more powerful as I've been doing it. So I've left behind all the tools and techniques and strategies and things that I used to have in my change work. And now I focus on a very particular leverage point, which is what I would call before psychology. So we don't get into directly, we do as a cascade or an implication, but we don't get directly into, oh, let's change our thinking, let's change our mindsets, let's have more psychological strategies, let's have more tools and techniques. Instead, we point to this very, what to start with looks hard to see, profound point, but then quite quickly becomes incredibly practical, day to day, and relevant, and
Mhm.
has implications for absolutely everything about not just our work, but our whole lives as well. And then people have this overwhelming sense of, how come I didn't see this before? So that's my nutshell. There's 25, 26 years packed into about 3 minutes there. So please feel free to probe away in where you want to there, Tim.
Well, thank you for the invitation, because I'm going to take it. I'm really curious. First, just sort of prior to starting, we were chatting about the difference between visual podcasting, where you can see the protagonists, and the audible ones. And as somebody with a background in NLP, I would have thought you kind of get and certainly I have colleagues who, for example, are deaf, and they find it really useful to actually watch lip read and see the captions, which you don't get. But I'm interested in this theory of mind and body, and this connectedness, the difference between what's happening in the inky blackness inside our head, and actually how important it is to see people, to be a body, and how those things are connected. Because clearly you've been through a bit of a change as somebody who's been looking at lots of models, NLP being one, you cited half a dozen others, to actually what is, pre-psychology, which is before we classified, categorized, diagnosed, and pathologized everything. So tell me about those differences, and maybe your preferences for audio or visual podcasting.
Well, okay. So the podcasting preferences are completely a different question, really. I mean, that's just practically my sense is a lot of people podcast whilst they're doing something else, like having a walk or doing the washing up. So not watching is, to me, going to make it more accessible. So I'll answer that one at a very, very practical level. But let's get into the more sort of slightly bigger question. So it's all about what we've been, I think, what we've been conditioned and codified and kind of what we're used to, as opposed to how the system works. So a lot of us find it easier to have rapport, intimacy, emotional, psychological intimacy, connection through seeing, through sight. And that makes total sense at one level, doesn't it? Now, what was interesting, I noticed that COVID, when COVID kicked in a couple of years ago, everyone started to not meet up and to do things via Zoom or whatever it was. And people were like, oh, well, it's not the same. It's not the same. It's not the same. Of course, it's not the same. But can it be as powerful? Can you have what I described as virtual intimacy? And yes, of course you can. Now, if you think about how the system works, how the mind works, there's probably people who you love who are not near you right now. And you can feel that love. If you think about your family, your friends, people you know, even people who have passed away, can you get a sense of closeness, intimacy, and connection with those people, even if they're not in the room with you right now? If you just spend 10 seconds, I mean, I can very easily do that. I can think of my kids. I can think of who aren't in the room with me right now. I can think of my brother who died 15 years ago. I can get a very close sense of connection, even though they're nowhere near me in proximity and they're not visually available to me. And
I'll explore that, but I'll let you follow your flow. But you make a really good point there that I'd like to unpack. But keep going.
yeah, so what I see is that I'm not saying it's the same at all. I'm not trying to say, oh, they're the same. And we don't need to ever, we could all live in a little room with a Zoom camera. No, but I'm saying it's possible to have that real sense of connection, even though you're not in the same room. And I have clients in Australia, in the Middle East, who I've never physically met. And we have an incredibly close relationship. We can share all sorts of things. And we've never been in the same room. And then to get more practical, often when I'm doing my work, which is coaching, I'll often suggest to the client, should we go for a walk and talk? They've been on screens all day, right? They've been on the Zoom meetings all day. So they get out in nature, I get out in nature, we put our headphones in, put the hood up so it's not too windy, and we have a lovely chat. And we don't need to be looking at a screen. We don't need to be looking at each other. and it allows the mind to have a break, have a rest, have a change, and actually to explore some things that it may not be easier to do in face to face. It might be. I mean, I'm not saying, but to me, so I think we get really, we're too used to a particular way of doing it, and then we can't do it. So I'm saying allow the system to be versatile, allow us to see that connection, intimacy is all available. And when we go right back to the very profound nature of what we are, the body mind is not the epicenter. The body mind is not where we start. It's how it appears we start, and it's the current scientific paradigm that everything consciousness comes from matter. Now we can dig into this more if you want to, but once we start to recognize that what we are is one mental field or consciousness, and then matter arises within that as an appearance. Of course, it makes sense that we can have this wonderful sense of oneness, even though we're not in the same physical space or proximity. Now, again, I can dive into any of that, but I'm going sort of across the top at the moment.
Okay, well, look, that's a perfect segue to an aha moment I had a moment ago. I think your point about how we carry people within us, okay, is interesting, and I would agree, but I'll probably take it as a slightly different approach. I would say it's less of a memory. If we are defined by our relationships with other people, as a crying infant, we define ourselves by how our carers respond to us. We define ourselves by what is inanimate and what is animated. And that's how we recognize the difference between us and the world. And so we are defined by relationship. So therefore, empirically, you could probably cut off my arm and I'd still be Tim. You could probably cut off my leg and I'd still be Tim. Okay. But if you removed all the social interactions I've ever had, I would not be Tim. I am formed by them. So I am not remembering my brother or my mother or my aunt. Okay. They are actually part of me. They are what has defined me. And if you look at Jung and the collective conscious, you could start looking at the shadow. We could look at internal family systems therapy. We could look at parts. But we are the composite of all those relationships. So I don't think we're recalling a separate person. We're recalling that person within us.
Yes.
I think that's just an interesting thing.
Well, I think it brings into the conversation the most fundamental question that I work with people. And this is where we start after a little bit of intake. We start with, who are we? Mm-hmm. Or actually, other ways I phrase it is, what are we? Mm-hmm. Now, most of us, if I said, oh, Tim, who are you? You would say, I'm Tim. You describe something about yourself, maybe your age, where you lived, your family. And I said, tell you some more. Tell me more. You'd say, well, I'm a funny guy. I like, I like cycling. You tell me some stuff. And that's Tim, right? And that's normally how we'd answer that question. Now, if we were to inquire into that question through what I would call direct inquiry, which is the basis of a lot of our work in quality of mind, if we were to inquire into that question, and what I mean by inquire is to answer that question from direct experience, direct in the moment experience, without reference to that wonderful conceptual mind that you've got, or we've all got, as if you are an alien being dropped into this moment, right? If you were to inquire into that question, you wouldn't say anything that you just said, because they're all beliefs and concepts, everything you've just said. If we ask the question in a slightly different way, who are we? And what is it about us that is is always there, is consistent and never changes? If we were to ask that question, what is it about us that never changes? What is it about Tim that never changes, that never comes and goes? It gives you a very different answer. A very different answer, and one that the thinking mind isn't involved in, actually. Now, does that question even make any sense as I say it like that? Because we could try this right now. Does it make any sense, the question?
Yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense to me because expanding on what I was saying a little earlier, you are defined, you are the response that you have on the world. So you may say,
No, that's not what I'm asking. That's not the question I'm asking.
but this is what I'm suggesting, okay, is so we may have different views, and that's fantastic because I think that actually makes for a really interesting discussion as we compare views and see if we can find consensus or difference. But my view, okay, is that I may say I'm a great guy, but if everyone says I'm a terrible person, okay, then probably I'm a terrible person because that is the effect that I am having. Okay, I may think I'm a terrible person, but everyone thinks I'm wonderful. So that is the effect that I'm having. If we are defined by our relationships with other people, by definition, those relationships, okay, mirror us. So I may turn around and say something about myself, but it's just purely delusional. The reality is
Right.
that I have.
I understand at that level, but I'm asking the question at a very different level, right?
Okay.
So we can talk about at that level, and that's the level that most people would talk about, right? That's within psychology. Now, I mentioned that quality of mind is before psychology, right? So you're going into concepts and beliefs, and at the level of the separate self, Tim. Now, if we can just ask the question to start with, because this is the one that is less asked, at the level I was mentioning about direct inquiry. So at direct inquiry, what we're doing is we are looking into the moment of experience we're in, the very moment of experience we're in, without any reference to anything conceptual or learnt, the past or the future, anything. And it's as if, as I say, we were a Martian, an alien dropped into this experience and just looking at this moment without any reference to anything we've been taught, learnt, or conceptualized. Now, if you ask yourself that question, what is it about me that is consistent and never comes and goes? So if you're up for it, let's just try this now for a couple of minutes. Are you up for this? Okay.
I suspect it's my opinion, my starting opinion, and let's see if it changes. Everything is up for change. Every cell in my body has changed, every circumstance, and clearly I am responding right now to the questions that you're asking.
No. Go back before that.
I would suggest everything
before
change.
Before that. Right. So rather than describe what you think is going on from your knowledge, literally go into this moment of experience. So don't know anything about the human system at the moment. Just go into this moment of experience and just notice, as if you were 6 years old, what is going on. Now, if you do that, and I'm going to ask you to tell me in a moment, my guess is you'll notice there is the appearance of thought, sensation, and perception. I'm not interested in the content of them, to be honest, at the moment. There is thoughts, perceptions, sensations. If I just call the human experience into three categories: thought, sensation, perception. There's those thoughts appearing. And it might be one like going, what's Piers on about? This isn't a very good podcast. There could be that thought. There could be the perception of the screen as you're looking at your Zoom. There could be the sensation of cold or uncomfortable tummy or whatever it is, right? So there's thought, sensation, perception going on. Is that fair?
Yeah, because if we go by, I'm a very, very strong left brain thinker, and therefore
don't go there for the moment. Don't go there. Don't go into any of that for the moment, right? You're diving into the content. You're diving in. It's so normal, right? Don't go in there. Just know, is there thought, sensation, perception appearing?
No, not unless I try and think them.
Well, okay, even if you don't think, what's happening?
If I don't think, then nothing happens.
Well, surely there's sensation and perception.
But that is thinking.
Right. Okay. So, okay. So there's experience happening.
I can't have sensation without thought.
You can't?
No.
So it depends how you define thought, I guess. Because in common language, we would call thinking. So we would call thinking in common language. There's lots of different ways you can define thinking as a second order cognitive overlay, right? So
Perception is the thinking process.
yeah,
So
okay. So
you think, feel,
in
see.
my previous fields, I would have called it the same. I was just trying to put it in everyday language for people. So let me try and fit to your language then. So is it fair to say within awareness, there's psychological activity occurring?
Yeah.
Whatever you want to call it, you can call it thinking, you can call it percepting. I was just putting those words in to try and make it easier, and I made it harder for you. So within awareness, there's psychological activity appearing.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
And in this moment, are you aware?
I think, therefore I am. So I am aware of being aware, but that itself may be delusional.
Right. So is it possible you can just for the moment stop adding bits in? And this is not a criticism to what you do, Tim. This is just us for the experiment, right? Is that you can literally just look at, without adding stuff in, just the pure process, if you like, of psychological activity appearing in awareness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there'll be some thinking there, and there'll be some perceiving, there'll be some sensing, that's going on. And those things are coming and going. So, in the 10 minutes we've been chatting, one might have appeared about breakfast, one might have appeared about, well, what's Piers doing there? Or, that they would have come and gone. And the same with all sorts of things in our psychology. Now, has anything, and do this in direct experience, right, rather than what you've learned, has anything not come and gone?
You floored me with don't use anything you've ever learned.
I know. And that's I can see that's a challenge for you.
Well, no, I mean, everything, my name is something that I have learned.
Yeah.
No,
I'm not talking about the content. I'm not talking about the content. This thing I'm asking you to point to is not in the content.
Right. Okay. So what is it you're looking for me to point to?
Exactly. Right. So is there something that isn't content? Is there something that is consistent, eternal, unchanging about the human experience that is not the content?
No.
Right. So this is the inquiry that I would start people on, right? Is to see that we've innocently, invisibly merged together two parts of the human experience: the content and the capacity. So I metaphor time, it might be helpful. The weather and the sky, right? So we look out the window and we would see the weather and we go, oh, it's actually bit sunny today. That's nice. It was raining yesterday. And the weather and the sky are merged together. We don't see the separation between the weather and the sky. There's words. The same with the screen and the movie. We're watching Netflix. We're watching the show. It's great. We don't really notice there's a screen. Now, if the movie was to change, if the weather was to change, the sky is still there and the screen's still there.
Mm-hmm.
In the metaphor. Right. Now, let's take that to the human experience. Now, come out of metaphor. The content of the experience, any perception within the psychological activity is constantly changing. Although some of it can feel like consistent. I can have the same thought more than once, of course, but it's changing, it's coming and going. Now, that's the content. What we're pointing people to see when we start exploring before psychology is there's a capacity, there's a space that all that activity comes into that never changes. You could call that consciousness, you could call that awareness, but I'm putting words on that now. But in direct experience, the first thing to do is to spot what comes and goes and what's there. Now they merge in together so seamlessly that we don't really notice it, as you said 2 minutes ago. But if we can unhook those, demerge those, we notice that the most consistent and the only consistent, eternal, universal thing about what we are is the capacity for awareness. And then within that capacity for awareness, all the activity of thinking, perceiving, and sensing appears. And if you look at that from direct experience, not from referencing knowledge and science, because that's already in the content, if you just look at that fresh, people will start to see something about that. So can you unhook the two?
No. For me, unhooking the two would be like unhooking water from the ocean.
Great.
They
Brilliant.
are the same.
Right. Yeah.
And the idea that you could separate that wave from this piece of shoreline, from that piece of ocean, is all collective.
I'm not talking about separating it. I'm talking about noticing, because you're right, it's one thing. I'm not talking about separating it. You never separate it. I'm talking about being able to, let's just call it, notice the difference.
Notice the difference between a wave and water, the ocean.
So you could call it, yeah. I mean, I often use the metaphor of a whirlpool and water.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at some water, there's a whirlpool. You see a whirlpool, an eddy. Is the eddy made of the water? Yeah, of course. Is it separate to the water? No. But does it have its own form? If you want to call it form or activity? Yes. Is it a separate entity to the water? No.
I'd agree with all of that, and which is why, in my parlance, process is more important. Okay, it's the process that it's going through that defines it, and that process is always changing.
Right. I agree with that. Now, the reason I talk about this with people is to help them understand there's quite a lot of implications. And one of the major implications is to see that the very thing that we've been conditioned invisibly, innocently to believe is us, the Tim, the Piers, isn't an entity. So science for the last 300-400 years has talked about materialism, which means the world of matter is primary, and consciousness comes from that, from atoms and molecules, and it starts with the brain. And that's what I used to think for many years. Now, if we can start to see that the very thing I thought was the epicenter, the entity, the me, the Piers, that sees an external world, actually comes and goes within consciousness as an activity of the mind, that kind of changes everything. So you start to see that this Piers, this idea of Piers, which is an avatar collection of all millions of things, programming and processes that we don't know about, right? Which is what you were pointing to, is a localization of the system, is nature, is not what I am essentially, because it comes and goes and it's not there consistently, because it comes and goes within awareness. This idea appeared. So even in the last half hour while we've been talking, there would have been some times I would have had some Piers, some identification with Piers. I would have noticed the Piers. And it looks like the experience of being alive is happening on behalf of that Piers. But there's other times where Piers has disappeared. There's still the raw isness of experience, but there's no Piers. So Piers is a thought, to put it in common language. Piers is a very, very consistent thought.
But this is where we
it's a
departed
thought.
earlier, and you said I was overthinking it. And where we departed earlier, as I said, there is no me. That your question was, what is the you that is consistent and always there? And I said there is none. You're now saying Piers is just a passing thought. It comes and goes. That goes back to what I was suggesting a little earlier, and you challenged. So
Well, the reason I
have
challenged
one
it
in a
was for,
loop here.
yeah, and the reason I challenged it is because it's what we think we are. So if I know that Piers is an avatar,
Mm-hmm.
an ever-changing, never fixed avatar,
Mm-hmm.
which is a culmination of the in-the-moment processes, that's not what I fundamentally am. Right. So it comes back to what we think we are essentially. So the reason I challenged it was because you were saying, well, what I am is a combination of all my experiences. And I'm like, well, only at the separate self level is that the case. At the fundamental level, the essential level, you're something prior to Tim. But what we've been taught from the very young age is that I am Piers. So I'm automatically, from the age of about 1 or 2, being told I'm a limited, finite thing, which has way less resourcefulness, love, connection, creativity, imagination, potential than what I am essentially, which is the universe, consciousness. And therefore, I then go into the world. I'm giving you a tiny, rapid synopsis of the whole thing, right? I then go into the world trying to find that wonderfulness I kind of know I am via believing I'm the separate self. And that is finite and often coming from scarcity. Right. So if we go into the world believing we are the separate self, the mistaken idea that that's where we start and end, this finite self. And if we're lucky, we can find connection. If we're lucky, we can find inspiration. If we're lucky, we can find resilience and creativity, rather than knowing that's what we are at our essence.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference. So the big shift for me in the last 25 years is shifting that. So what I used to do was to help that separate self get stronger about the world, push through its limitations, overcome suffering with better mindsets, psychological strategies, tools, techniques. I had them coming out of my briefcase, and now I point people to wake up, if you want to use that language, to see what you truly are, and to see that innocently, invisibly, the separate self mind has got itself so self-identified that it misses what's available right under its nose, and it goes off into trying to protect and seek into the world that it thinks is separate, that needs to sort of deal with, rather than recognizing we're being lived by nature, and the Piers is an avatar. If I use that language, it is an appearance in the moment, ever changing, and if I believe that that's what I am, then I'm bound to be finite and limited.
I'd love to sort of explore the depth side of this a little bit more, and maybe
Death, did you
we could
say?
have sort of two conversations. But from a practical level, okay, as you start talking to coaches and leaders and business people who do think of themselves as individuals, who do carve out roles, be it
Yes.
father, leader, CEO, human resources, whatever. Okay. When you start to unpick that identity and say it's just continuous process and flow, and realistically, you have no agency per se, it's just something that happens.
Yeah.
How does that result in them continually saying, well, we'll continue to use you to take our organization forward? Actually, all of that, all of those ratchet mechanisms, all of those toolkits that you've thrown out, they logically should also throw out.
Yeah. Well, you don't, yes, it's a great question. So we put them on the side for a bit. We don't throw them out, right? We put them on the side, and it's not where we focus to start with. So the initial inquiry is all just as you've mentioned, because what happens is that once people have the recognition, the realization, and this has to be realization based. It can't be intellectual. It can't be, oh yeah, I've heard what you said, blah, blah, blah. It can only be a seeing, if you want to use that language. It can only be realized. And once the penny starts to drop and people start to see that, what happens, and this is the most beautiful thing to see in the work, is that people's minds start to recalibrate, to see, to change the emphasis of what they pay attention to, what of those ratchets and tools they pick up and don't. Mm-hmm. And an obviousness occurs, a flow state, because you've used that word, and that's absolutely right. So if you think about flow, and this is where we often start with people to give them a little taste of this, is to see that actually when we're at our very best, whether that's in sport or work or in relationship, we're on this kind of flow where there is cognition happening and there's perception and sensation and thought happening, but you feel like you've got the wind behind you. It's just all falling into place. Things occur to you, never occurred to you. You can overcome difficulty quite easily. All this wonderful stuff. Now, I often ask people a question, business people at the beginning of our work, how often do you think you are in flow state? And they're like, well, 5-10% if I'm lucky, of my week. So, and I said, what's it like when you're there? Oh, it's amazing. Things happen. It feels better, all that kind of stuff. So what happens as a result of this inquiry, although it might feel very profound and abstract, is that the amount of time people spend in that flow state increases. And it carries on, increases. There's not a half-life. There's an opposite. Actually, it carries on. So people spend much more time in flow. Now, when they're in flow, all the tools and the techniques and the processes and the structures and things either fall away or they just find the one that works for them in that moment. So they've still got their programmed mind. It's not like you become, it's not like you become an idiot. So all the things they picked up in the game of life, if you want to call it, are still there, but they come in the right moment when needed, and a lot of them fall away. So an example of that would be, let's say someone comes into this work and they've been a regular meditator or something like that. They probably find they'll do a lot less of that because they were using their meditation or their mindfulness as an antidote for their misunderstanding of the mind. So they don't need that anymore. They might do it sometimes, who knows, but they won't need that. So that will fall away, because they're living now in a more meditative state in their day-to-day without having to do the practice of. They might carry on doing some of it, but usually that kind of drops off a little bit. So, and then other approaches or psychological strategies that they'd learned will fall away, or it will come in when needed. So it's not like we abandon all of that and go and live at the top of a mountain and do nothing. Absolutely not. As you go back into the game of life, you've got more flow, more obviousness, more clarity. You generally have a lot less on your mind. So the utilitarian functioning of the thinking mind, in the way I describe thinking, I understand you different language there, is still there, but you find you think a lot less. And this sort of obviousness comes through, this flow comes through. There's a lot less procrastination. There's a lot less kind of, I guess, trying to work things out. You put things on, let's call it the back burner more, and then this just comes through. So the inspiration, insight comes through. So it's not we abandon all those things. We just put them on the side to look at something else. And then later on, we see what gets picked back up by the system, if you want to call it that. And this is where beautiful habits change and evolve in a really quite elegant way, as people start to see the kind of things they start to say yes to and they start to say no to. And they generally tend to find that lovely thing of less is more. So there's more serendipity and synchronicity happening in what appears like's going on, and things are just sort of happening. The world's coming towards them a little more rather than I'm hamster wheeling it to try and get there as you're more in flow. Does that answer the question a little bit, Tim?
Yes. I'm interested in this idea of flow being an absence of thought. It's not my experience.
It's not an absence of thought. So I would make a distinction between, and these are just names, but I help people understand. Like, so let's call it, there's a bliss state you could be in, right? And that's almost like, I don't know if you've ever done one of those sensory deprivation chambers where you lie in a sort of a salt solution and time just disappears completely, and you're just absolutely kind of blissed out, right? There's nothing going on. That's not what flow is to me. I mean, they're cousins as states. In flow, there can still be thinking. So a thought might occur. So, you sort of talk to sports people, and, I remember Wayne Rooney once being said, "How do you know what to do, Wayne?" He goes, "Well, I just look up and I just know where to put the ball," right? Or Ayrton Senna would say, "God was driving." So there's still thinking going on. It's not an absence of thought, because in flow, there's still you're still doing stuff, but the amount of thinking would probably, for most people, decrease. The amount of what I would call layering. So layering is when we add some sort of narrative on. And the other thing that happens, which is really quite interesting, is, and this is just a sort of contemporary thing we do, we tend nowadays, I'm generalizing horribly, of course, to conceptualize our feelings rather than feel them. So we think our feelings. So what we might say is, yeah, I'm feeling lonely, or I'm feeling angry, or I'm feeling disappointed. And, we would conceptualize that with thought rather than actually just feel like a 1-year-old would. So we've tended to rely on thinking because of the way we're academically taught, maybe the way merit badged around intellectualizing and academia has been, and that piece, that sort of reflectiveness is still valuable, but we just tend to do a lot less of it when we're more calibrated to what I'm pointing to here. So I know, I mean, I used to think a lot more than I do now. It doesn't mean I don't think now. Of course I do. And it depends what I'm doing. It's a very utilitarian, functional thing to have, is thinking. If I'm trying to look at a spreadsheet and try and work out what the numbers are doing at the bottom, then I need thinking. If I'm planning a trip to a holiday, I need thinking. Of course I do. So, but I do a lot less thinking than I used to, and things tend to go better. So I'm generalizing, but I'm just giving you a clue. It's not the absence of thinking flow at all, but the thinking that comes through tends not to be on behalf of the separate self.
So what are you doing to fill that void that perhaps was once overcrowded, analytical, diagnostic, fragmented thinking, that existential angst, that self-reflection,
Yeah.
that wonder of the whole world? When all of that is removed, or substantially removed, what are you doing instead?
Nothing. Well, I say nothing. The mind's just at rest. And when the mind is at rest, it's peace, it's joy, it's connection. So this is the wonderful thing. So, I used to think I used to have to sort of think my way to be happy. And that's some of the NLP would even point that way. But actually, what you start to recognize is, well, what's a baby doing when it's lying on its back in the first few months, staring, what it looks like, staring into its feet, or staring into, it's just at peace. It's connected.
We actually know the answer to that, and we know that it's calculating, analyzing, diagnosing. This is where attachment theory comes from. This is where a relationship
comes from. Okay, I meant before that. I meant
it's grasping, it's opening the drawers, it's wandering.
No, I meant a little before that.
Learning machine. It's certainly not sat there doing nothing.
Okay, so nothing is the wrong word, and I meant there's the sense of contentment and peace that's there. Doesn't mean there isn't. Okay, so here's a big distinction. So there is an aliveness, there is an intelligence, if you want to call it that, to the system, right? So the tree that you can look out at your window that has thousands of leaves that drop at different moments of different bits of the day and the season, there's an intelligence behind all that, and it's just happening. So why does the one leaf drop at Tuesday 4:44 and land there, and why does one drop at Wednesday 12:15 and drop there? Thousands of factors the science would know some of and not know most of, right? So that's so we are being lived. I'm not saying inert when I say nothing. I'm not saying inert. I meant at the thinking mind level, nothing. Right now, what you experience for me when there's less of that, again, the language is a little clumsy here, the self-mind overlay going on, the world is a more peaceful, richer place to be in. Now, this is interesting, if you look at neuroscience now, that's sort of playing around in this, that people find that when people are having really rich experiences, what they describe as rich experiences, there's less brain activity. Right now, I would have thought, 10 years ago, if someone has asked me that question, I would go, well, yeah, if I'm having a really rich experience, there should be more brain activity because it's all epicenter brain. But actually what they find is that, from the studies, less brain activity equals a richer experience. When I say richer, I mean a sort of more peaceful, more creative, more connected experience.
I don't think it's necessarily the volume of brain activity, it's the location. We know the difference between left and right hemisphere. We know the difference between white noise and default mode.
So,
and default
but if we take the pointing of that, I'm trying to keep this, not trying to go too scientific for a podcast here, but if you look at the direction of that, I would ask people to check out in direct experience of themselves, what's a nicer place to be, busy mind or calm mind? Right? Is it what's a better place to be? But if you ask that question to your person on the street, how was Christmas? Oh, it's great. I had a really nice, relaxed and revitalized, just hanging out with friends, blah, blah, blah. Less busy mind, right? Generally, and I'm really generalizing this at a kind of hopefully an accessible level, is not only a more pleasant, peaceful place to be, but actually doesn't stop us being effective in the world. We don't become inert and kind of shrivel up on the sofa and do nothing, because in that quieter mind, insight comes through, and that's often the case, isn't it? People go for a walk and they're, oh yeah, that's why people go for a run, isn't it? People will go for a run to quieten the mind chatter down to get new thought. So to answer your question, what's happening when I'm not doing all this extra thinking? Well, there's space. I would use the language of there's space in the mind, and in that space there seems more peace, contentment, okayness, and space for insight, emergence. I talk a lot to organizations about emergence, emergent dialogue, emergent space, because most of the conversations people are having in organizations, of course generalizing here, are from their kind of metaphor hard drive, where people are trying to compare separate realities, influence each other, go, well, I think this, well, that's interesting, well, I think this, have you thought of thinking like this? Right now, an emergence is a different kind of space, right, where something comes almost from the room, and it's not really from the room, but you know what I mean, right? And that's oh yeah, and we don't really know whose idea it was. It came from the conversation, and people just have this sense of, oh yeah. So the answer to your question is more peace, more contentment, more insight, more sense of oneness comes from that.
That certainly reminds me of people like Nancy Klein, whose book Time to Think talks about this egalitarian universal approach to communication. For example, and we see this in tribal elders, sit in a circle, everyone takes a turn, no one tries to dominate. Now, that's certainly not without thought. That's this idea of collectiveness. That's this idea of community. It's this idea of connection. I get that feeling from the latter part of what you're saying, and I could endorse that. That is my own experience.
Well, yeah, and I think the difference for me, it's interesting you say that, is in the early days of my career, that space of emergence, you can see it's valuable at a symptomatic level for organizations to do that, and we would we would do activities and workshops to try and help that space happen, right? Through serious play, symbolic modeling, clean language, tools and techniques to help people get into that fresher space where new thought comes in, where people can see something slightly differently. Now, I would now not look at going there via tools and techniques and strategies like those approaches I talked about. I instead, although that's tactically very helpful for a workshop or a conversation or for an action learning set or for whatever you're doing, I'm now much more interested in getting people to see the nature of how that can occur, let's call it innately or organically, and how come it doesn't happen more of the time is a really fascinating question. I was like, well, why aren't people in this space more often? Because it feels really productive, you know. And the reason is because of the self-identification. It's because we're not, our conditioning hasn't sort of pointed us that way. And the mind tends to go towards the separate self. And thinking about that can get in the way of this wider space where that emergence might come from. Now, what we tend to do in modern society is we like to reverse engineer everything. And I was definitely doing that with NLP. I didn't realize at the time. There's a tool and technique to go, oh, this state of emergence is available. How do we get there? Oh, here's a tool, here's a technique, here's an approach, here's a model, here's a way of sitting. And Nancy Klein's very interesting actually in her work, because the first part of what she points to, I completely endorse. And then she gives a technique for it. And I'm like, no, don't do that. Well, not don't do that because it's still useful, but why not point to the fact that that very first thing you're pointing to is our innate nature, apart from all the thinking we've got, right? So we're only reason we're having to reverse engineer nowadays is as a compensation to our misunderstanding on the nature of the mind. And then what we've done is that we think that the strategy or the psychological strategy or the tool or technique is the way to get there, overlooking what's available initially if we hadn't misunderstood what we are initially. So therefore, we've got into this habit of reverse engineering. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I think the reverse engineering thing, and I think the prevalence of anxiety, depression, mental health, all correlated with larger global economy, larger urbanization, larger industrialization. And what we're increasingly seeing is the deconstruction of life into symbols, diagnostics, quick fixes, etc., which is very left brain, very symbolic, very administrative, at the expense of right brain thinking, which tends to be more holistic, more joined up. And so there is a real shift. And we're seeing, for example, psychopathy increase from about 1.5% of the generalized population to 3%. We're seeing more antisocial and bipolar and other types of disorders that are, and again, even the definition of disorder or abnormal, where somehow there is a universal normal and somehow we're not normal in a planet of 7.5 billion people. What is normal? At best, it can only be average, and normal is different according to culture, context, circumstances, age, religion, faith, etc. So there is no normality. But in our pursuit of productivity, industrialization, segmentation, specialization, symbolism, cashing in, making products, selling products, etc., we are all driven towards that. So would you say that what you represent is a pendulum swing to the more integrated, right brain, holistic, nature-driven understanding of relationship?
I would say that what I'm pointing to, because I agree with what you're saying, but I'm going back a bit before that, before that, because all of those things that you've talked about that are creating what's going on and in what's turning up for us is as a symptom. I think all of those things are symptoms of this, and it may not look like there's enough in what I'm saying, but there absolutely is a symptom of our the fundamental misunderstanding of what we are. Because what's happened is there's been a deification of the self, that there's been all of these things you're talking about what's happening in society and the constructs of how we're operating at a systemic level, I think are as a consequence of us not understanding at the very paradigm level of the fabric of reality. If we saw that it is consciousness first, and that's the language I would use, and that consciousness creates the appearance of matter and all the other things, it would completely shift all the dynamics that are turning up in society and culture. I mean, I'm not saying it would happen overnight, of course, but there'd be a massive shift from me to we. There's been a big, I'm putting this again in sort of common language, the me we thing. But if because the last 300 years we've thought, because science has pointed us to think that we are materialists, physicalism is right.
Although that itself is quite localized. I mean, a book that I learned from, and I'm certainly not expert, but I definitely recommend the book, is How the World Thinks, and it explores the difference in thinking, philosophy, religion, faith, belief, and culture. If you take Japan, China, India, UK, America, they have very different ideas of individualism, collectivism, etc. So I'm wondering, so when you say we, the generic we, I assume you're really talking about westernized global economy we, because actually an awful lot of what you say wouldn't apply in Mongolia, for example.
I am talking about those prevalent cultures, the US, the Western world. Yeah, I'm talking about, how come it seems to be difficult to solve climate change? Things like that. I'm talking about that those presenting issues, systemic issues, that are driven mainly by the bigger nations' cultures, which tend to have a me way of thinking. Yes, I am talking about that, but also if you look at mental health, for example, the implications and the consequences for understanding the nature that consciousness first for mental health would be huge, and education. So wherever you look at society and how it's organizing itself in what I call the game of life, there'd be consequences. Now, there are pockets, of course, of cultures that see that, but they seem to get overshadowed by the big movers and shakers. Whether that's the Chinese, the Russians, the Americans, Western Europe, etc. So I think that shift would have implications, ripples absolutely everywhere. And I think for me, the way we can see this most, because you could go, what can I do about that? Well, see it for yourself first. See it, and the easiest way, and it really is, it may not appear it, but it is really relatively simple through your own direct inquiry, which we're just not taught to do. So it's not conventional, but it's quite simple once you've done it a few times. And I find this in workshops, people for the first sort of half hour, they're like, what are you on about? And then give it an hour, they're like, oh my gosh, I start to see what you're seeing. Yeah. And then the thinking comes in and drowns it out. And then we spend the rest of the workshop sort of taking that away again. But that there can be a glimpse of an insight as to what we are really quite quickly for people. And it's accessible for anyone. You don't have to be smart or old or young or anyone. So it's the most universal thing we can start to see. And if people started to see that, then they're going to need a little bit of pointing with the implications and, how come we don't see this more, blah, 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 blah. But the recognition is really quite accessible and straightforward. And people can see it in their day to day, and they can see what difference it makes. And that, I think, is somewhere to start if we wanted to see systemic change in how the world unfolds, if you want to call it that.
And the companies that you work with, as a result of this, do they become more egalitarian, less hegemony orientated, and more, I don't know, whole?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. They would have more humanity, if I can use that word, more love,
Mhm.
They're still commercial outfits and that kind of stuff. So it's not like they suddenly, they tend to have a more charitable way of thinking, but they have more appreciation for, they get more perspective on humanity. It's not driven by this kind of burning need to achieve and hit these metrics and blah 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 blah, very financial things. So absolutely right. And that's lovely. Now I work in pockets of big organizations where it doesn't touch the size of the main bit, but the bit I work with, like, so I work with some big companies and I work with bits of them, so the
Mhm.
bit of the company will, and it doesn't unfortunately get up
Mhm.
there yet, but I often work with smaller businesses, and that's wonderful, because what they then do is they see this, and then anyone new joining the organization gets an understanding, and it becomes part of their culture, becomes part of their DNA. And they call it their secret sauce.
Mhm.
So not only does it become a nice place, and much nicer place to work than where they've ever been used to, but they seem to get more juice out of it. So the less is more is there. And that's a beautiful thing to see. And the lovely benefit is this doesn't just help work.
Mhm.
And actually, the first place people often see this is in their other aspects of their life, with their parenting, their relationships, their health, their fitness, their attitude to money, or whatever it is. So it's completely whole person, if you want to call it that.
Well, this has been, I think, an intellectual, but it's not meant to be an intellectual roller coaster ride. Perhaps in some respects, I am a poor candidate if I found it an intellectual roller coaster ride, but it's certainly been interesting throughout. Um, Occasionally quite challenging, and I have to say, occasionally perhaps I've missed the point or misunderstood. But nonetheless, it's been really interesting and really fruitful. So I'm really grateful.
Well, I appreciate you going along the roller coaster, Tim. And you know, it's so easy for us to miss the point, and I did for decades, right? So, and I'm pointing to one point that I personally believe, and others do, that could be transformational, but it's so hidden, this point. To find it, we have to be kind of like, not there, not there, not there, not there, there. Oh, there. Well, there's nothing there, surely. Now, if people are a little bit curious, I've got other YouTubes and podcasts that go more into the direct inquiry piece, where people can have a little go at it. We also have something else we call Taste the Mango, which is a new thing we're setting up, which is just about looking at the inquiry piece. And I think you spoke to an associate of mine, Katrin. We set up Taste the Mango just to do the direct inquiry piece, because we're trying to make that as accessible as possible and not esoteric and all highfalutin like it might sound like it is, just to say, hey, give it a go. So if people have got a little bit of curiosity from this conversation, Tim, then I would urge people just to have a little bit further, because it is something very easy to kind of go, oh, that's nice, and then completely forget about, because it's not at the top of your agenda, because your busy mind comes in with all the other things you've got to do, because it's 2024 now and blah, 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 blah. But if people can give this just a few minutes, it can start to get, there can be a resonance, I suppose. And then you're kind of like a little curiosity to want to go, well, okay, maybe there's something here, right?
I
Maybe there is a
certainly
different
know.
way.
I certainly know. I listened to Katrina's podcast at least twice after having participated in it, and I was there.
Yeah.
And I think this will be another the same. I think people will really enjoy reflecting on this. And, I'm very grateful. I'm going to include some links that go alongside this podcast so that people can follow you and see. And you do have quite a large body of work. And so there is a lot of resources there for anyone who is interested. And if you're not interested, have a go anyway,
Yeah, well,
because
that's a
that's what they're
great
learning
piece
in.
of advice. I think what we'd say is that, the first few times you listen to this, it's like, whoa, no, no, no. It's so easy then just to pass it over, but give it another go. I mean, we've just been making some sort of more how-to videos, just short ones, like, okay, this is what's probably going to happen. You're going to get tripped up by your thinking, right? So just go to that bit, and then once it clicks, it's kind of like, oh yeah,
Mhm.
and that's lovely. But it's don't worry about getting it right or wrong to start with. Have a play, you know. And then this is the lovely thing about the mind. We can have a play, and because often people go, there's something there that resonates, but I'm not quite sure what it is or how I get there. So it can then feel like it gets in the too hard box. Just push through that hump because it gets easier. It's like learning to snowboard. Because we're not used to walking like, you know, on a piece of wood that goes down a hill on a funny angle. So and we're not used to doing direct inquiry because it's not how we've been taught to use the mind. But Tim, I really appreciate your openness and gameness for being part of the conversation, and you're obviously a super curious person. So that's that, and actually that's a wonderful thing about us, isn't it? We could be super curious. Any of us can be.
Well, I'm really grateful for you allowing me to have something really interesting to be curious about.
Good. Well,
Great.
carry on. And if anyone, including yourself, ever wants to reach out and ask a question about it, I love talking about this stuff, as you can probably tell, because I ramble on. So I'm always there to help if people want to contact me on LinkedIn or email or something, or check out the other podcasts and YouTubes.
And for those watching, because we do put this on YouTube, and listening, because we do an audio version of this. So whatever your circumstances, we'll include that information so that you can follow.
Thank you.
Thank you
Brilliant.
very much indeed.
Have a great year.
And you.